Hangout on air is live. You know what? I should probably change my screen resolution. Oh, maybe it's too late. It's just going to totally screw it all up since I'm already going. Oh, whatever. Never mind. I'll zoom it. All right. Welcome. Scale this up really big. So I've gotten really interested in React lately. When I gave my talk at JSConf, I hadn't really done anything with it. I looked at some of the code samples and almost puked on my keyboard because I thought it looked so terrible. And then within like 20 minutes of using, I was like, actually, this is kind of cool. And then within an hour, I was sold. And after an hour of playing with it, I realized that I really, really wanted a good router, because how the heck do you make a web page without a router anymore? And so I looked around at what people were doing in React for routing, and it was all terrible and reminded me of before I found Ember. And so I thought, I wonder what an Ember-style router would look like in React and how difficult it would be to implement. So again, I messed with React for about an hour, and then I immediately started on a router. But before we get into that, let's just kind of talk about what routing is all about. So a route is an application state, right? Anytime you get to a route, your app is in some sort of state. State is really just data. Therefore, your route is data. So in React, you could look at that data by just handing a property to a component called route, and then say which route you're at. So just think about routes as data and nothing more. And so in React, the idea is you start at data at the top, and then it just trickles all the way down through anything that cares about it. So I could have two routes here, index and contact, and then I could pass along more information, like the contact ID, and then render into the document body. Now in my app, with something like this, in my render method, I could have some navigation or something up here, and then down here I could render my active route, which up here I look at my props route. If it's contact, return the contact component. If it's edit, return the edit component. Otherwise, just do an index component. So you can see that by just thinking about your routes as data, you can just branch in your components, and then it'll redraw, and then React will make it efficient. You're not actually redrawing the whole page. You get to pretend like you're redrawing the whole page, and then React will make it happen. So to hook something like this up to the URL, which is the next step, I made a dumb little router here. What's that? No, I'm just talking about routing generally in React right now. So here's a dumb router. Up here, I'm just going to store my array of routes. To start, I'll just add a hash change listener, and then match is kind of my public API here, where I'm going to hand it some regular expression, and then there we go. I'll hand it some regular expression, and then if that regular expression matches, down here when I handle the route, I will call that handler. So usage down here, I could say router.match contact, and then render my app with the contact route and pass it a contact ID. I could hit the edit route and then pass it the ID as well. Otherwise, if it's just sort of nothing, then I'll just render my index. So this is kind of how a lot of people are doing routing in React, where they just have these handlers like Page.js or Backbone's router, where you match some sort of route, it gets parsed, gives you some sort of data, and then you render your app with that information from the very top. Works pretty well. I really hate this, though. That makes me really sad. to have a whole lot of branching all over the place, where all your components now, when you have nested views going on, you're going to have a lot of branching. And it's kind of hard actually for the next developer or even you to come back and look at your app and have a good idea about how it's structured and how the views relate to each other. And we're also now coupling these potential child routes right into the app component. And so now they, if one of them moves, they have to move together, and you've got to shuffle a lot of code around. This would be pretty cool if I just got the property of the route to render. So now my app doesn't have to think about what are all of my app component doesn't have to think about what are all the possible things that could be rendered as my child view, and instead the outside world just gives it to me, and I just render it or yield it.
So basically the object knows how to render itself.
Yeah, and then you just hand that to the app. So to get this kind of API with what I've got so far in these demos, I can just keep doing what I'm doing, and now my route sets up this contact, and then I pass in that as active route to my app components. Now my app doesn't have to care about the branching. I've moved that up to my route handler. The route handler decides what component to render. That's the child. And that feels nice until you start doing more view nesting. So now if I want to go to contact/ID/profile, and I want that profile to be a child view of the contact view, which is a child view of the app view, which is pretty common. Now I have to set up the profile view, hand that as the active route to the contact view, and then hand that as the active route to the app view. So that'll get really gross as well. And again, it's hard to look at your code and have a good sense of how your application is structured.
Does this all driven by URL?
Yeah, so when the URL matches this regular expression, this function will get called. And again, little React side note, both times I'm rendering app into document body. And so when the URL changes, it feels like I'm redrawing my entire app, but it's not. React is just doing the DOM diff and only changing the pieces that need to change.
So it's server side.
Right. Yeah, this is all in the client. This would be cool. Have a sitemap instead. So instead of all these route handlers that you've got to set up components and then pass them around to other components and manage all of this view hierarchy yourself, it'd be great if you could just say, here's my sitemap, here's how all of my views relate to each other. So your views don't have to know how they relate to each other. You have some other config that says how all of your views relate to each other. So you can think about an app like this. Got our application, you have a dashboard, you have a calendar feature, an inbox feature, and a users feature. And then we have some nesting here. When you're in the calendar, you can have the week view, month view, day view, or today. Messages live UI inside of the inbox. And then the users even goes pretty deep to where you could have some user page and then like some extra nesting in there with their profile. And so this is what the actual API is for React Nested Router. There's this route component, and you give it a handler. This handler is another component, so it's just a React class. And then you give these routes names, say what their path is, and then their handler. So really nice to be able to just look at this and understand your whole application at a glance. You know how all the views are nested, you know how they're related to each other. Let's see, what do we have? And then, yeah, to use it, you just, like any other component, you just render those routes into whatever you want. So like I'm saying here, eventually you have to couple your components in your app somewhere. A lot of people don't like coupling. I think all of us don't like, and we try to avoid it a lot. But when you're building out some UI, you're going to have coupling eventually, because you've got to say this view needs to render this view, which needs to render this view. So you can either couple it here in this config, or you can screw around with some handlers and couple it there. I prefer this a lot. Did I see a hand go up? No? All right. This looks a lot like Ember's router. It's got some differences, though, where there are no index routes, where it doesn't automatically render some leaf. Here you just set its path to something that matches. And we always match the child first, and then we know from the child all the way up to parents all of those routes that are active, and then render all of those as well. So like here, you can go to /calendar. Well, actually, I don't even need this path now that I'm looking at this. And then we could set our month view as the default. And so when month matches, calendar's going to match, and you'll get that wrapped stuff, but month is kind of like your index route for those of you that are familiar with Ember's router. Weekday, and then you see here, I don't need to inherit any sort of paths or anything. The paths don't inherit their parent route's paths, and that gives you the flexibility to have /today in your app be the calendar view for today, and still receive all of that view nesting from its parent route without inheriting its URL, which I find really useful. Passes in parameters just like other routers, and then you can access those inside of your handlers. So again here, route name users, we don't have a path, so it can never get matched on its own. And instead you give a path to one of its children, and then the child matches, and that will be the one that renders. And again, with the flexibility of the path, you can have user ID, and then you can have profile ID. You don't need to inherit the paths of the parents. Some of you might be asking, well, what if you did that? Then this user route isn't going to receive that ID parameter, and so you can't go and find the user, right? Because if you land at profile and the URL has no ID, there's no way to take that data and then go find a user for the profile. So the router will actually bark at you if a child is matched and then a parent needs some parameter, and it'll say, hey, you didn't put an ID in this child route, so the parent isn't going to know what to do. There.
So is there a way in like the nested route underneath you can add the ID for the object above it? Does that make sense? Like another layer of nesting?
No, because in React you can never go up and find out from someone above you. So you're just required to put that. Well, it doesn't even matter, because if your URL doesn't have the ID in it, there's just absolutely no way. The parent isn't going to have an ID either, because it gets it from the URL. So.
But so in this case, would the URL be like user/32/profile/32?
No, this would just be /profiles32. It doesn't inherit paths.
If you wanted that, you make a path with that as a path.
Yeah, if I wanted to, then I would say user/profile/ID. Or if I want it to be like how you're used to looking at these kinds of things, you would do it like that. But you always specify whatever URL you want.
You can read the ID parameter in both the profile and the user handler, right?
Yeah, they both get it.
But regardless of how you specify the path, you have to have the ID in there, and it will be basically interpreted in the router.
Yeah.
In the handler.
That would work too if I haven't used this route anywhere else. It'll also yell at you if you use the same route in two places. But yeah, this just gives you the flexibility to make your URLs whatever they need to be, because they don't necessarily have to be coupled to your view hierarchy. Just so long as the URL contains the data you need, then you can use that URL.
/ID is
Is that better?
Provide that ID value in something else.
What's that?
Could you provide it in something else? If you wanted to inherit that ID from the parent route.
It's not inherit. It's the URL contains the ID, right? And if you landed that route, that's where you need to get the ID.
I'm just saying, could you provide ID in your route definition on line 314? ID equals, go and grab the current user sessions ID. I'm just like,
So basically hard coding one of the rounds in a child route.
yeah.
Well, then you would just do that, right? Yeah, well, it's not dynamic at that point, right?
Passing the other parameters, to
Yeah, you can do whatever you need, and then they'll all come in. All right, so let's look at some code. Let's see. All right. All right, so let's look at some dynamic segments.
Can I ask you a question real quick?
Yeah.
Related to that. So along those same lines, so what if could you do something like you wanted, like let's say stick with the user profiles thing, but I've got like my profile and I wanted to have a special URL like /me, but it's really just the user's /my ID profile, and that's the view I want to use. Could I somehow build? I mean, does that?
Yeah, so /me, you're going to need to have some sort of model data in your app or session data, right? To be able to go and fetch that. It's no different than your server-side stuff, right?
Yeah, I'm just asking, how would you? Because
So
my
so
component is expecting that to come in through the URL. So
if you want to get the data from there, if you just want /me to show your profile, you're going to have some sort of logged-in session, right? And that logged-in session is going to contain your ID. So now we're talking about model state, not app state.
And your handler is responsible and it knows to go get it.
Yeah, your handler doesn't pull from the URL, it pulls it from local storage or from some token or hits the server and finds that out.
I think what he's saying is, can we use the same component, right? So like you have two paths.
Oh yeah.
They both have the same handler, and then you just put some logic in that component that says, if there's a user ID, use it. Otherwise, go grab it from the session.
Or you could even wrap it. The new one could wrap the child component so that it.
Yeah, you can just do this, and now your profile says, do I have a user ID parameter? No. All right, go get it from my session. Otherwise, get it from the URL.
In this case, we're looking to see if the user ID for you.
Yeah, that'll yell at you. So you do it like that, and now you don't get the nesting. All right.
Would it yell at you, or would it just, oh, you're duplicating?
I don't know if it throws an error. It should probably just warn. Because then in this case, you could go get the data elsewhere.
I mean, you could always in the handler just look if the parameter, if the ID is unique.
See, this is what happens when you make things a little too flexible. No, yeah, so that's good feedback. If it's throwing an error, it should probably just warn instead, because you might be able to get that information away from the URL. All right, I'm going to move on. I got other stuff to cover. So down here, I've got my routes defined. So my route is my app. That's ugly colors. Its name is user, path is user ID, and then down here I've got my user ID task and my task ID. Let's just look at this in the browser. So I click on Bob, I get user ID 123, and then I click on his food task, and I get sub his user ID, and then I have his task ID. And then, of course, back button, all this stuff works. I can refresh it, and it'll land where it needs to.
So is your handler parsing it right out of the URL to show that on the screen, or is that set up?
So the way that it works, so the top level component app, I just drop in this .props.activeRoute. So down here, it's going to be whichever one of these is active. And then, well, I guess it can only be this one or none, right? And then in my user route, I have this .props.params. So this is how you access the stuff, the data from the URL in your route handler.
Is that a React thing?
That's the router. Yeah. React has this .props. Anything that you pass to a component will come in this .props. And then the router brings in this params thing, and then you can access user ID there. And then it'll dump out its active route. And in this case, we don't have an active route when we're just at this level, so nothing renders in there. And now as soon as I click on a task, now I have an active route. And so active route is an instance of task. And I can pull in the user ID parameters. I don't have to go up and ask parents or anything like that. The components aren't concerned about your data hierarchy. They all get it from the URL. And then your task is also available in there. So if we look at these one more time, user ID and task ID are on params.
So all the parents are available at any, I mean, just the whole scope's available at any level.
There aren't scopes, they're independent, right? Because they all have their own full URL. And so you're just pulling it, like, which allows me to, well, I mean, it's a new concept. So what's really nice about this, that they all own their full URL, is if I don't want the task view to be nested inside of the user view, I just go like this. And it'll still just work, because they all are getting their own parameters and their own other stuff. And I guess I probably want to get rid of active route in the parent one. But I don't have to, I'm able to define the coupling components in a config object, or XML, or whatever you want to do. But then the components themselves are actually still totally decoupled from each other. You can just move them around, nest the views however you need to, and not have a whole bunch of, like, oh shoot, all my links are messed up because it used to be users.profile, and I have to go change all my links to profile, like you do a number. Yeah?
So how would you, though, pass in props, like let's say the component's expecting some props that aren't part of the URL, or I mean, that's kind of magically abstracted away now. How would you?
These components don't care about other props other than to deal with being a route handler. Like, those are the only props that they need. And then you get that data from the URL, and then you can pass along any new props that you figure out that you decide you need to a different component, to like a view component inside of there. Yeah, that's a good question. Also, you can do this, and foo will be available as bar to that. Oh, actually, you know what? So that answers that other question. So env.user ID. Interesting. Need to make a note of that in my head. All right.
So I was going to ask a similar question. It seems like the React way is to have a component always get passed its data, right?
Nope. It's totally not the React way.
Not at all. Yeah,
Otherwise, set state is useless, right?
Right.
What's the point of set state if you always just pass properties?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is what confused me a lot when I was making it now, because I didn't know where to put my model. Like,
So there's props and there's state.
Yeah.
Props you do not own. Those get handed to you from the outside world, and you never change them.
Right.
Like the user ID, so I can go and fetch it. State you own. Like, the data lives at that layer of your app. And so the way that this works is you get your params to go find your state and manage it yourself.
would you do that in pretty much every page, or would you try to make other view components, like you were saying, that were passing their data?
I think a great pattern for this is to have your and my examples don't show it, and maybe I should show like my supposed best practice, but I think that these things should all just kind of return a view that's kind of associated to them. So these you can think of as like routes,
Right.
and then they render a view, and you can pass the properties to that,
That makes sense.
and then the route's going to own that data, but you're not forced to do that, but you could. And the reason this is important is because you can land at any route at any time, right? And so that route has to be capable of fetching its own data. Otherwise, you can't land there. You'd have to come from some other spot, get the data, and then pass it in.
Yeah.
All right, so that is a pretty simple example. Oh, we didn't talk about links. So the link component is pretty slick. You say link to task, so the name of the route. And again, the route's names don't inherit their parent route's names, which makes things more flexible when you're moving your views around. You don't have to rename all of your links. And then the parameters that go up to the URL, you pass in as properties. And so here I would pass in this user ID. This one's kind of a dumb example. Let's see the master detail. Yeah. Let's find a link in here. All right, this one's good. All right, so Here, I want to render all the links for my contacts. Let me pull open this one. I should probably do some sort of loading thing. All right, so got my users on the left, and then people on the right. So to get all of those links, I've got this UL, and then I render my contacts. My contacts up here. I map over my contact state, then return these links. And so the parameters that I want to go up in the URL, I just pass in as properties. So link to contact with the ID of contact ID. And now this gives me a link to, you can see up here, contact/Jeremy, that's the ID for Jeremy, Yehuda, etc. And these are fully accessible links, so I can right-click this, open in a new tab, and it pulls open. I can command-click it, get these new tabs to pop up underneath. And then, of course, refresh, and it all works. So again, you can move your view hierarchy around in your route config, and all of your links are still going to work because your routes have their own unique names that don't inherit from parents.
How about on that link component, if you wanted to pass like a class, a tag? Is there a way to pass that through?
Yeah, it's just a component, so you do class name.
Okay.
Unless I'm dumb and I forgot to let you pass that in. Also, the link component is adding automatically an active class to that anchor tag. So if I go back to my dynamic segments, it knows all the way up the route tree if all of those links are active. So if I've got a link to a parent and to a child, and I'm at the child, both the parent and the child will know that they're active links. So I can have Sally read and her task be read. And you don't have to do any of that stuff in your app to decide if you're at that route or not. The auth-flow example I think is pretty cool. So if I try to come to the dashboard, I can go to About because it's not authenticated. If I try to go to the dashboard, it sends me to login. You can see up here. Type in the wrong password. It says bad login. Password 1. Then I log in. Now I'm at the dashboard. And if I hit back, oh, it takes me to login. Oh, why does it take me there? I shouldn't. Anyway. And now when I jump back and forth between these, it doesn't take me to the log anymore. Log out, and then try to come back to the dashboard. I think I messed up my demo. But anyway, you've got replace state as a tool now too, so that when you enter a route, oh, let's look at the code. So here are my routes. I've got my app, log in, log out, about, and dashboard. Let's look at the dashboard route because it's the interesting one. So I mix in this authenticated route. So authenticated route, in React you have these methods that you can put on statics. And so these are methods that can be called from, come on. Oh, I think I did this dot constructor. Anyway, it will allow you to do authenticated route, blah. So they're just methods that live on the class definition rather than on an instance of the class. And so the router will call these hooks, will transition to and will transition from when you're entering or leaving a route. And for the login case, you can come in and check some authentication library, see if you're logged in. If you're not, then store this transition that comes in, and then redirect to login. And now when I go to login, I saved that attempted transition here. And then after, so I'll have my little form, and I'll submit it, and then get my email and my password, try to authenticate with my email and password again. If I'm not logged in, then I set an error state, and that's when we got that little message at the bottom. Otherwise, I made it, and if I have an attempted transition from before, yeah, that transition has a retry method, and so then I can retry it and then go where I was trying to go. Otherwise, I can just send them off to a default spot. And that's the whole thing. The authentication library, of course, is going to be doing auth equals, where is it? So the authentication library has a little bit going on, but it's just sort of like a fake deal. But as far as getting your views to work and have that kind of difficult workflow is actually really simple with this. Jason?
Replace with is supposed to get rid of history, right?
Replace with does get rid of history. We changed some API and he did redirect in there, and I think that's why it didn't. So I'm going to go look at that. Retry will, yeah, it'll replace. Yeah. So that's cool. Another great use case for these transition hooks is consider a form. So I'm at my dashboard, I click on a form, and I'm filling it out, and then I decide to go to the dashboard. I have this little thing that pops up and says, hey, you've got unsaved information, are you sure you want to leave? I'm like, oh, no, I don't want to leave. And so then I'll stay there. So you can prevent people from transitioning away based on some sort of validation. Also note the URL. Right now we're at /form. When I click on dashboard, it changes. But then if I hit cancel, it puts it right back. If the user comes in and types something in here, we get the same thing, and then we'll also be able to put it right back. So kind of cool. But if I say OK, then I'll move on. Or if this is empty, then it doesn't care. So the code for this one, so I've just got these two routes, two handlers, and got will transition from. You get the transition, and then since this is a static method, this inside of the method isn't going to be the current component that you're in. So we pass in the component to you. Go and look at the value of their input, and then if it's not empty, transition.abort, and then that puts you right back to where you used to be without any entry in your history. Otherwise, move on. What else? Oh, query parameters. These are important. I can go to Bob, or I can go to Bob with query parameters. And Bob here now has show age true up in the URL. This is really simple to make happen. Link to user, user ID, and then your query. This might freak you out a little bit if you're unfamiliar with JSX. The first curly say, hey, I'm going to do some JavaScript in here. The second are an object literal. So instead I could say, I can do that instead. Yeah, so it's just a property or query params are just properties to links. And then down in the component, you've got this.props.params, and you've got this.props.query. And query will contain any query parameters that came from the URL. This uses nodes, query parameter serialization and deserialization. So it's the same as what you would do in the server, like as far as how arrays and objects and stuff get serialized. Yeah.
Is it possible right now, if you have a nested state like one inside another, right now by default, does it reload the whole page if you switch out the inner one? So say you're switching to another URL and the parent view is going to stay the same.
These two?
Yeah, those two. Is it reloading the top part, or is it?
No, because it's React, right? And so we get to pretend like we redraw the whole thing. Then the virtual DOM says, oh, only these two nodes changed, and so it only changes that instead of everything.
Technically, it is reloading. It's just not redrawing the whole page, right? It's actually calling a new instance of that handler.
Yeah. It also knows that some things haven't changed at all, like properties haven't changed, state hasn't changed, stuff like that. And so some of your code doesn't get called
What
again.
about what's calling that parent controller thing that calls the server? Will it recall the server using data?
Yeah, so let's well, yeah, and so your data stores need to be smart, and me and Derek are doing a dance here. Your data stores need to be smart and cache that information so when it gets asked a second time that it gives it to you. However, in this case, these are two different. Let me think. So if a parent is fetching data and a child is maybe not, and maybe a child is fetching data too, and you're switching here, does that go and call those fetches? I'm not sure, but again.
To give a simple example on our app right now in Angular, where we have this page that shows like a big image here, and then there's all those little images over here that you can click. But it turns out that clicking a little image and refreshing the whole page is like really distracting. You know what I mean? So we had to change it so that a little image, it just kind of replaces the big image without changing the page. But the router we were using in Angular made that very difficult for us because it wanted to reload it.
If that image is the same, it's not going to get changed. Like if it's got the same properties and everything else.
I think the important part is to consider code execution different from technology that are not going to be used to it.
Right.
So it's going to execute code, but it's only going to redraw the parts that are different.
As long as your code's smart enough for the server.
Right. As long as you're caching stuff.
Oh, whoops, I was debugging something. Yeah, so this component did mount right there. Yeah, those hooks are still all going to be called. So yeah, your code gets called every time you switch a route, but so your stores need to be smart and return cached objects. No, because at the end of the day, if a DOM nodes, if everything is the same about the DOM node, it won't touch it. And then you don't want to make the extra server request, so you've got to have some caching on your data layer. But that's not unique to this router because everyone doing React generally is like redrawing the whole app. Yeah.
I don't know if you have a wizard or something like that, but have you playing around with that at all?
Making a wizard, like from one screen to the next?
Right, so if you have a sequence of steps, and each step you have a number of configurations that you're doing. So it's a lot more than just passing parameters.
Well, those aren't states, right?
Yeah, you're establishing state each session.
Yeah, they're session state, not app state, right?
Yeah, if you code it that way, yeah.
So I would view all of that to be the same route, but then that's a workflow within that route.
Right.
Maybe persist that stuff to the query parameters.
If you just pop into the URL somewhere in the middle of the wizard, it would be valid.
Yeah.
So you'd have to have some mechanism in there to detect that.
Well, that's where I'm saying that's not an application state. That's a workflow within a state. And so you wouldn't try to persist that to a URL, except maybe query parameters. And then you'd persist those pieces as query parameters.
Right.
Validate if you've got everything you need for that step, and if not, start over from the top. But yeah, so routes are app state. What you're talking about is session state, maybe even model state. Here is my favorite example. Partial app loading. So I've got my app.js here, a dashboard, and an inbox. And if I were to bundle my whole app together into one big file, it'd be like 10 megabytes. And so you obviously don't want to do that. And so instead, I've made this async React component mixin, and it does some stuff with Webpack and its bundling. And when it loads, when the component mounts, it goes and loads the bundle that is represented at this route. And I added a set timeout so that you can kind of feel it and see it more. So when you render, you say, hey, do I have that other component yet? If I do, then go ahead and render it. If I don't, call pre-render. And so now I've got these pre-components, so the things that I still want to draw something before the extra code is loaded. And so while I'm waiting for that code to load, I can draw some UI and tell the user, hey, I'm thinking here. And then this is just stuff with Webpack where I can go and lazily load in these other pieces. And nothing else is any different. I didn't have to do anything unique for the router at all for this. So if I go to open up the network tab, we'll see down here when I click. Oops. When I click dashboard, it says it's loading. Then down here, I get this chunk file. And then when I click on inbox, it says it's loading. And then I get another chunk down here. And now as I navigate around, it doesn't have to go and load those because I've already got them. I think this is huge. We've got a giant app, a really big app with a lot of UI surface area. And so to load up, to just throw Browserify at like 800 JavaScript files would be ridiculous. So this way you can split up that app.
Can you unload parts?
Browsers don't let you do that, right?
Well, I know, but I mean, if Canvas, if you browse around everywhere, you don't want to have all of Canvas.
Sure you do. Then it'll be so fast. What else do you have memory for?
Actually, yeah, you can spin out those stuff with JavaScript.
Yeah?
Yeah, as long as you just lose all the references to any of the functions or any of the...
So actually, yeah, React is going to be really good about this because it only hangs on to, well, I don't know, the browser. You can't get rid of the browser like saying, I loaded this JavaScript file, right?
You can
like the memory.
close the JavaScript file, and it parses, and then after the result of that JavaScript file means that nothing else in the page is holding on to any references from any objects in that JavaScript file. Then all of the memory introduced by that JavaScript file will be cleaned up.
Yeah.
There won't be any way of getting into that code.
But you've got no control.
But you still have that file loaded.
But it doesn't hurt your memory.
Yeah. And since it works with the virtual DOM, it doesn't hold a whole lot in memory because it's got its 2 diffs and that's it. And then and I guess if you set up a bunch of stuff outside of there, but the view spot is still going to be memory efficient. So yeah, in your model stuff, you're going to need some sort of LRU cache stuff to remove things.
In your code, where you showed this, where you have those require statements.
Yeah, this.
So I'm confused because that's.
This is all just Webpack. I don't know how Webpack works.
Okay, then I'll just take your word for it.
Yeah. Yep. I had an example that was just like using GetScript, and some guy with Webpack was like, check this out. I was like, okay, merge. Yeah, but basically, as I understand it, you say, hey, this bundle is a lazy thing, so don't actually go get anything, but know that I'm going to ask you to go get it sometime soon. And then up here, when you say this dot bundle, that is the thing that actually goes and finds. That's when this gets loaded.
Okay.
So it's all like weird plugin stuff to tell it, hey, I'm going to ask for this later, but not yet.
So it's just preparing to load.
Yeah. Yeah. That's kind of it. It's on my GitHub at React Nested Router. The React world has seemed to just not try to fight the module wars and just said we're using NPM and Browserify, or NPM and CommonJS. So it's pretty lovely. You can just NPM install this and then require it into your app and then throw Browserify at it and you've got it. And then you don't have to configure your routes with the JSX stuff if you're still really angry at that. Or you don't feel like it fits for your routes, so you can just do JavaScript. Looks just as good here. Bunch of demos, API docs. We're kind of moving. The API, we just did another kind of big shift on it, but hopefully we're done. It's a lot simpler now than it was yesterday. Yeah. No, so we're actually back to where we were in the first place. So we used to have routes and then route, and then we made the top level thing not a component, instead it was a function, and now we're able to make it just route. Like there's just route and link, and that's it. Yeah, any other questions? Oh, the food is here. I didn't even notice it come in.
Really?
I'm sorry. Yeah, why didn't anyone yell at me? No, it's like cold and gross. Go eat, no questions.
So is that
Used to. The only managers are the browser that's loading the file.
Yes, we have.
Yeah.
You don't check.
That's fine if your browser works. Like if you can have a time where it's like the user hasn't done anything for however long.
Or have it like in good handlers so that like.
Well, when we go to this route, rather than actually just doing like a push state, we'll actually go into a page load. So that's like, we'll take advantage of it. We've gone through 20 pages, so let's.
That is a perfect.
Let's prune things.
I appreciate that.
Now, if you
It's the equivalent of Ruby on Rails.
if you use your own part of this decade, oh, it's all functional.
Yeah.
You would never actually. No, you wouldn't. You couldn't hire anyone. You train everyone for 6 months. I can't believe it's the food company. Why didn't anyone yell at us?